to the Haddin series. Ted Haddin himself is here today, and we welcome Michele Forman, who is, I suppose the best thing to say, she is located in the history department, where she is director of media studies, although she also has lots of other titles. And as a documentary filmmaker, she has worked for and with Spike Lee, and she was the associate producer for his movie Four Little Girls about the Birmingham bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963. She has also received an Emmy nomination in 2001. She has made a documentary on breast cancer survivors who climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, and I will say nothing more about her, even though we have been discussing why Chris Marker is French. Or she said she wouldn't tell me. But
I'll reveal to all. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so pleased to be speaking to such a good crowd at this time of the term. I know lunch has a great deal to do with it, and a little less having to do with a somewhat obscure French filmmaker. Giving you an introduction of the mysteries of Chris Marker is somewhat complicated by Chris Marker's own efforts at completely obfuscating his own life. When he was asked for an interview or to introduce one of his works, he would decline. When he was asked to confirm one of the widely circulating rumors about himself, that he was born in Ulaanbaatar or in the suburbs of Paris, that he was a member of the French resistance, or that he was actually a US Army parachutist at the end of World War II, he would refuse to clarify and probably was the source for all of these rumors. And when he was asked to supply a photograph of himself to any interested magazine, he very often supplied a portrait of his cat. Even his own name is a mask for his identity. He was born Christian Francois Bouche-Villeneuve in 1921, and he is said to have confided in his close friend and collaborator, Alain Resnais, that he wanted to escape the Frenchness of his name. So sometime in the 1940s, he introduced himself as Chris Marker, very often interpreted as a marker for the director, or as one of the many rumors claimed, that he and Alain Resnais wanted to give him a name that had no ethnic or nationalistic root, that it was the kind of name one would discover in America, that only an American would have, and that they were inspired by the magic marker pen. So he's a pretty playful and slippery character. As he began to age, he began to release more and more actual biographical information about himself, and we no longer had to rely on the strange interviews with his friends and colleagues that often called him a Martian or someone from another planet. So he's sort of similar to our own homegrown odd character, Sun Ra. He recently passed away, but was a productive producer of work up through July 29th of this year, when he died on his 91st birthday. His self-construction really began prior to his filmmaking career. He started off, as much as we can tell, he sort of came to the world full-born as a writer and journalist, working in Paris in the post-war years. With many of his peers at the time, there was a burgeoning not only film society movement spearheaded by André Bazin, but there was a flourishing magazine and journal culture in post-war Paris. And he was engaged in leftist political essay writing at the time. And he really wanted to use a sort of subjective style of the essay form to examine the politics and challenges of the day. There was a huge distrust among Marker's peers in these encompassing explanatory narratives. They felt that it was that kind of modernist, overarching, master of the universe type of narrative that led to some of the overconfidence and led to some of the tragedies of World War II. He is credited as one of the inventors of the essay film. Some of you might be familiar with the landmark 1955 film Night and Fog. It was the very first film about the Holocaust, about World War II, that Alain Resnais directed. Chris Marker wrote the script that was read by Jean Carroll, a poet and a Holocaust survivor, a French poet and Holocaust survivor. So during this period of time, Marker very often appears in the footnotes, in the small credits that roll by on screens. And if you were to read classic cinematic textbooks, even up through the early 1990s, the only place you would find Chris Marker mentioned is if you flipped back, he would be that asterisk. He would be footnote 27. He was one of those figures that didn't really neatly fit in to many of the prevailing themes of the Nouvelle Vague, the French New Wave, which was very similar in orientation to much of our sort of American independent teen culture. Much of the interest of the French New Wave was a documentary style narrative structure, one that really focused on everyday people, particularly youth culture, and a burgeoning new openness about sexuality and sexual relationships. Those were not Chris Marker's preoccupations. His preoccupation through most of his life was in leftist political activism, though he was no longer, he never really joined any group. He was never a member of the French Communist Party. However, he formed a Marxist arts collective called Slon. So it was the Society for the Offering of New Works. And he was considered one of those behind-the-scenes instigators and catalysts for creative experimentation. And much of his preoccupation beyond political interest in equality, greater equality around the world, also focused on experimentation and form. He was someone who really translated the literary into the visual. He was a writer first, and he was always trying to figure out ways to be able to sort of push and pull at this very, very narrow, limiting, linear form of film. We very often think about filmic representation, particularly documentary representation, as being very simplistic, very reductive, that it takes a complex, nuanced subject and really boils it down and flattens it. He was always pushing against that linearity, and that was part of the reason it was tough to understand his work within the context of his fellow filmmakers at the time. But he was always, because of his experimentation, a hero. He was always the filmmaker's filmmaker. And we can see here in a very expressive portrait by Wim Wenders that was used as one of the publicity stills. One of the few images, it's already Marker as an older man. Photo montage with a gravestone of the Titanic and his ever-present cat, which we will get to in a moment. This is Chris Marker's online totem. Part of the reclamation, part of Marker's move out of the footnotes and into the sort of centrality of contemporary film criticism really has to do with the birth of the internet and the animal rights movement. Marker was very interested in a kind of interactive storytelling. But the technology of his day in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even the 80s, Soleil's time period that we'll look today, really didn't afford him. He was constantly playing with the grammar and syntax that was available to him in the traditional film form to be able to sort of break free of that relentless linear narrative that just marches from second 0, second 1, second 2, all the way to the end of the feature. What he wanted was an internet. What he wanted was interaction. And finally, I'm thrilled that he was able to live as long to be able to see the internet, because that's where his last decade, even though he became a cinematic lion and could have produced work for any of the major French studios, broadcasters, he chose to actually create this online alter identity. This is his avatar, Guillaume, who lives in Second Life. For those of you who may not be familiar, Second Life is a sort of web-based little, simulated world. And Guillaume the cat is a filmmaker in this world, and there is a whole cottage industry of critics and theorists who are scouring Second Life looking for markers, new productions. He was one of the first artists commissioned by the Centre Georges Pompidou to produce a digital artwork using the technology of the time in the early 90s. Marker was tasked with creating one of the first CD-ROMs that is an artistic work, and it is just a marvel of its day. Now it feels quite old. Any old website has better navigation. But again, we begin to see some of the facsimiles of Guillaume guiding us through these, almost as if, as in the Inferno sort of tour guide through Chris Marker's corners of his mind. And this CD-ROM is available for the gift shop for purchase at the Pompidou Center, should you choose to visit. We need to take a step back just to understand some of Marker's political orientation. And so I'll begin actually in 1953 when Marker, who wrote quite a bit about African art in some of the political journals at the time, was commissioned by the Présence Africaine to make a film about African art. There's really supposed to be a celebration of African art and their collections in Paris. He contacted his friend Alain René because Alain was much better with the camera. Chris Marker didn't feel confident. And the two of them would collaborate on this work. And instead of making the celebratory piece about African art that they were commissioned to do, they actually questioned the entire institutional practice of removing African art from its indigenous culture and putting it in Western museums. The film exposes and very often enacts an imperial gaze on these African art objects, and the voiceover commentary actually extends the criticism to France's own colonial enterprises. Just to give you a little snippet of his voiceover that he authored: "We are the Martians of Africa. We arrive from our planet with our ways of seeing, our white magic, our machines. We will cure the black of his illnesses, that is certain, and he will catch ours, that is certain too. Whether he loses or gains from the change, his art will not survive." The film was titled Statues Also Die, and it won awards at Cannes. But it was obviously rejected by its commissioning body. Présence Africaine did not find it satisfactory. But perhaps more significantly for the launch of an experimental artist, his work was censored by the government. Nothing launches a career like a good censorship, but they were actually quite threatened by the implications, because France was fighting at this time to maintain hold over French Algeria. And it wasn't until Algeria, the Algerian enterprise, was completely lost that France allowed the remaining 15 minutes of this film to be screened publicly. The objects out of their cultural origin bear a completely different meaning to those that see them on pedestals and vitrines in museums. As the voiceover states, where we see the picturesque, a member of the black community sees the face of a culture. Similar to Walter Benjamin's assertion that the art object in the modern West has become detached from cultural meaning, from its aura, Marker further asserts that the Western culture that reveres art objects as separate from everyday life is a culture of death. Visually, Marker and René attempt to revivify the African artifacts through active camera movements, which pan, tilt, and zoom in and out of the objects. So that's fairly traditional cinema language. It's the language of montage that was really pioneered by Soviet filmmakers Dziga Vertov and Sergei Eisenstein. What is perhaps the most radical element using the sort of traditional language of film is that the filmmakers challenge the direction of the gaze within the film as a means of further criticizing the unidirectional nature of power over culture. The objects look directly into the camera lens, breaking the fourth wall between spectator and subject. This extradiegetic gaze is accompanied by an intradiegetic gaze in which the camera observes the interaction between a black woman and an African statue in the museum. It's this look, and here is the shot, it is this look between the woman and the art that launches the active camera movements, in effect liberating the objects from their fixed, inanimate position in the Western institution of the museum. Marker and Renee go on to represent the objects not as exotic and other, but as natural extensions of a culture and environment by constructing a montage of the art objects and everyday items from Africa, including ethnographic footage. Towards the end of the half-hour film of Les Statues, a scene of a gorilla being hunted and killed is shown. The violent death is shocking and drives home the argument Marker and Renee wish to make about the stakes of colonialism. It is not a benign practice. Nora Alter, in her commentary on the film, states, just as humans and animals die, so do civilizations and their artifacts. She further observes that Marker does not distinguish between living and inanimate beings in this film, heightening a quality inherent in film itself, which is able to preserve and mummify the living and add motion and life to things. Film makes interchangeable the living and the dead or inanimate. Marker capitalizes and magnifies this in Les Statues by using new technology to recreate for the viewer the experience of animism, the ancient religious belief that all objects possess a soul. As the works come back to life, the voiceover reminds the viewers that these figures once had special practical or symbolic function or roles. They served as tributes to fertility, to the health or beauty of children, to the gods, to the telling of stories, all features of a civilization which have been lost. The killing of the gorilla in the film doubles or triples this concept of death, at once functioning as a symbol of a vibrant civilization being extinguished, and again as a symbol of how film itself creates objects out of living beings, and conversely, forever reanimates the dead by playing over and over again the killing. Marker displays an awareness of the film medium's participation in preserving and freezing this flow of life, deracinating it from its cultural and historical moment, and presenting it back as containable, knowable, holdable object. This discomfort with the medium will drive much of his reflexive treatment of his footage, repeatedly drawing attention to the form's artifice. Also, it indicates an early interest in animals on film, and animals as a vehicle to express the middle ground between human self-consciousness and objects' non-consciousness, a subject which Marker continues to explore throughout his work. This brings us, if we jump forward in time, to Soleil, which is widely considered his masterpiece. Soleil is a film that he produced in 1982, and by this point he really began to perfect his non-linearity within the restrictions of a linear film form. He was no longer just trying things out. He was able to sort of master this new language. And that's part of the reason that I was drawn to Marker, because I'm primarily a filmmaker. I'm a producer of work. And many times, even though I can lose myself in the film with the best of audiences, there is a part of me that I sort of know everybody's tricks because I use them too. And when I watch most documentary work, I sort of know how they pulled off every effect. With Marker, I find again and again, after repeated viewings, I can't quite figure it out. And I think about this as analogous to a story my mother told me about her very first job. She was living in Montreal, and she knew how to sew, like all girls her age knew how to sew. And she got a job for a dressmaker. And this dressmaker, his whole business relied on knockoffs of haute couture gowns for cheap. And so he needed a young woman to be able to try on the sort of perfect size gown, the sort of basic size, and that was my mom. So she would go and try on the gowns, and as she's changing in, she would examine the seams and sort of figure out how it's constructed, and then come back, and they would hastily make their knockoffs. That's sort of how I feel like my critical studies in Chris Marker developed. I could never, as just a basic viewer, figure out his tricks. How was he pulling this off? And so I was able to, through the miracle of digital technology, rip this film and be able to move through it frame by frame. I mean, now almost all of his work exists online. In the early years in writing about him, I would try and find bootleg copies on eBay of some of his work that had gone out of publication. I mean, now that he's passed away, and certainly as some of his themes about animal rights and particularly his consideration of technology, have become more and more relevant to our sort of cultural moment. More and more of his works are finding themselves in wide release. But in the early days, I sort of felt like my mom, having to sneak into the changing room to be able to sort of find those seams. So I've talked a little about some of his stylistic considerations, some of his innovation. I think maybe now's a good moment to play a clip. This is the opening of Soleil.
The first image he told me about was of 3 children on a road in Iceland in 1965. He said that for him it was the image of happiness, and also that he had tried several times to link it to other images, but it never worked. He wrote me, "One day I'll have to put it all alone at the beginning that they filmed, with a long piece of black leading. If they don't see happiness in the picture, at least they'll see the black." He wrote, "I'm just back from Hokkaido, the northern island. Rich and hurried Japanese take the plane, others take the ferry. Waiting, immobility, snatches of sleep. Curiously, all of that makes me think of a past or future war. Night trains, air raids, fallout shelters, small fragments of war enshrined in everyday life. He liked the fragility of those moments suspended in time, those memories whose only function had been to leave behind nothing but memories. He wrote, "I've been around the world several times, and now only banalities still interest me. On this trip, I've tracked it with the relentlessness of a bounty hunter. At dawn, we'll be in Tokyo." He used to write me from Africa. He contrasted African time to European time, and also to Asian time. He said that in the 19th century, mankind had come to terms with space, and that the great question of the 20th was the coexistence of different concepts of time. By the way, did you know that there are emus in the Ile-de-France? He wrote me that in the Bijago Islands, it's the young girls who choose their fiancés. He wrote me that in the suburbs of Tokyo, there is a temple consecrated to cats. I wish I could convey you the simplicity, the lack of affectation of this couple who had come to place an inscribed wooden slat in the cat cemetery, so their cat Tora would be protected. No, she wasn't dead, only run away. That on the day of her death, no one would know how to pray for her, how to intercede with death so that he would call her by her right name. So they had to come there, both of them, under the rain, to perform the rite that would repair the web of time that had been broken. He wrote me, "I will have spent my life trying to understand the function of remembering, which is not the opposite of forgetting, but rather its lining. We do not remember, We rewrite memory much as history is rewritten. How can one remember it first?
So with Sunless, we can start with the title. Soleil, or Sunless, and we see it in a number of languages, suggests the sort of world of the movie theater. I mean, it is the world of projections of images rather than the real thing. I think he's also alluding to the sort of fundamental question of Plato's cave, that we sort of exist in this sort of world of apparition, that we are seeing these projections on the wall and we believe them to be the truth of our universe. And he is really laying down the gauntlet for his viewers to question these sort of world of representations we find ourselves in, to be able to make a judgment about how much of this can we really trust and believe, how critically are we really examining these sort of easy explanatory narratives that sort of flow into our lives, that gives us this illusion of knowing things about places and people and things that we've never directly experienced. So this film is itself taking a look at the sort of world that exists, this world of images. He further sort of frames this consideration through another fiction, as if his own name and his own biography isn't sort of tricky enough. He gives us a film that is essentially an epistolary film. It's a film that is structured, its rhythmic nature. You could already tell from this short excerpt. This is a feature-length 90-minute film. He wrote me. He wrote me. He wrote me. We're hearing these fictional letters from a filmmaker that is credited at the end with the name of Sandor Krasna, who does not exist. His name itself even suggests a sort of anagram of a name. And the film was released in French, English, German, and Japanese, each with a different woman and a female actress reading these fictionalized letters. Alexander Stewart is the one you hear here in the original version. So he managed the voiceover. These were not just produced after the fact. So we have this sort of disembodied female voice reading these letters from nowhere. We really are sort of caught in the simulacrum. There is no actual original. There is nothing that allows us to touch the truth. We're sort of lost in this sort of sunless world, this sort of world of media-constructed images that keep accruing and that we're having to piece together. And there are times in the film in which he uses this device, and you can already see the usefulness of a sort of letter-structured or epistolary-structured voiceover. It allows him to hop, skip, and jump through place, through time, through subject matter. It allows for all these different asides. We come back to those emus in the Ile-de-France. I don't have time to really go into it today, but if you want to talk to me after over some peach cobbler, happy to give you my reading of that. But he's able to sort of move through a number of different subjects because the expectation is so much lower than we have for the traditional documentary film, because of course the traditional documentary has a very narrow focus, and it's usually something that's exotic or rare that you would think, I'm going to point to this interesting thing in the world, show you all of its details. You will come back edified as a result of this encounter, knowing it. He wants to undermine that entire process of mastering a subject just because he sat in front of a feature-length film about it. There is no through line. He reuses these shots. He lets you know right away you are sort of part of this sort of constructed process. You realize pretty quickly the film he's writing about is the one we're watching, this image, so now you all know the Icelandic children, they mean happiness. Those Icelandic children show up again and again in this film and take on new recursive meanings. But he is enacting the process of representation, reclamation of memory, and rewriting of history through this, this very complex narrative structure. And there is a theoretical model for this, even before we have the internet. A theorist, a French theorist, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, theorized about this narrative model, and they called it the rhizome. It was an urge away from the sort of linear, progressive, chronological, thematically organized narrative. It was the idea that narratives were going to take on this much more sort of organic, chaotic generative structure. And that really is what Marker was able to achieve by the time the technology reached him. But this is what he is pushing at. And so he is using a multiplicity of genres and cinematic techniques to achieve that feeling or sensation on the part of the audience. So the film, in many ways, even though it's about the politics of representation, I really think of it more as a performance or enactment of representation, because it really forces you, the audience member, to construct your own meaning as you go. There are times in which the letters match what you see on screen, and there are times where you really have to choose. I'm either going to figure out what I'm watching, or I'm going to figure out what I'm hearing, but I cannot do both at the same time. And so he puts you in a pretty tense situation. I mean, I've transcribed this film and I've watched it many times, and I think even now, if you were to just drop me in the middle of it, I couldn't tell you where we were chronologically. He creates a sort of spiral of narrative. He also uses the gaze in a very interesting way, and I'm going to just click here. Let's see if I can move us to a good spot. Well, I am not able to really get us there.
A people of emptiness, a vertical people. Frankly, have you ever heard of anything stupider than to say to people as they teach in film schools not to look at the camera?
So with his sort of relationship, that much of documentary, I mean, the title of the talk is Voyeurizing the Voyagers. This is a line pulled from one of the many Sandor Krasna letters, where he's very critical of the sort of myth that surrounds the documentary project. That you have this idea that somehow we as an audience are privileged to peek behind the curtain and be able to sort of see things that are really not sort of meant or privileged for us to see, and that's part of the fascination. This idea, the hook of documentary, is being able to be given access to these realms that we ourselves have not been allowed to go. And that one of the ways that he finds that's important to counter that direction of power, very similar to Statues Also Die, is to redirect that gaze and have that confrontational look into the lens. And so he alludes to this very early on in the film, and then proceeds to use the gaze in a particularly novel way. He also uses an analog synthesizer. He's trying to sort of give us the tools of the filmmaker, trying to make all of us understand the process that he goes through as an effort to get us to mistrust some of the media that we consume. He is creating a deliberately unstable viewing experience and undermining that possibility of a master narrative. You're always made aware that you're just watching a film, and that since he reconstructs and re-edits some of the same footage, and you can understand how these shots take on a series of different meanings, that meaning itself is not stable within these media productions. To give you an example of how he uses that synthesizer.
I went back to Narita for the birthday of one of the victims of the struggle. The demo was unreal. I had the impression of acting in Brigadoon, of waking up 10 years later in the midst of the same players with the same blue lobsters and police, the same helmeted adolescents, the same banners and the same slogan, down at the airport. Only one thing has been added, the airport, precisely. But with its single runway and the barbed wire that chokes it, it looks more besieged than victorious. My pal Hayao Yamaneko has found a solution. If the images of the present don't change, then change the images of the past. He showed me the clashes of the 60s treated by a synthesizer. Pictures that are less deceptive, he says, with the conviction of a fanatic. than those you see on television. At least they proclaim themselves to be what they are, images, not the portable and compact form of an already inaccessible reality.
Marker critiques this media culture and makes it visible and knowable and understandable, moves it out of the theoretical by using the device of this analog visual synthesizer board. His graphic designer friend, Hayao Yamaneko, designs video games, which becomes another section of the film. And we see the film beginning to sort of send these documentary images that we've experienced through the zone, as he calls it, in an allusion to Andrei Tarkovsky's film, The Stalker. The zone in the film is a site in the woods where a meteor hit and now mysteriously can make one's deepest wish come true. What a great sort of reference for our relationship to film and media culture, that sort of aspirational notion. But the zone has a distinctly macabre feel, certainly undergirded by the sort of electronic tones here. And so Marker's zone processes these rather banal documentary images so they come out as brightly colored, solarized, flattened silhouettes. The images become icons of themselves, and they call attention to their status as representations. There's no other way to be able to take a look at these. They no longer give you that indexical, authentic relationship, that photographic relationship to reality. And these unnaturally colored images, while they're really vivid, they're also really distorted. It's hard to know. And they're reminiscent of Warhol's sort of acid-colored silk screens, but also to MRI scans, which were first familiar and introduced in 1977. So we have this sort of mapping and reading of the body as well as technology. He uses this language to be able to draw attention to this untrustworthiness and artificiality of filmic representation. But he also innovates in one other really striking way that I'm just going to hit on at the end. He uses the animal look and the animal gaze as a way, just as he uses this analog synthesizer board to dramatize and make extreme the experience of film viewing, he also uses the animal look or the animal gaze as a method to remind human audience members about the way in which the media subjugates the radical other, in this case, another species, and the way in which the sort of incomplete animal-human interaction or communication winds up inviting a certain amount of reflection on what is it that we're doing to these others around us? How does this participate in other hierarchies of power that we see, particularly in his exploration of political excess, political exploitation around the world? I'm going to jump forward to one of the most striking scenes is when Marker chooses to dramatically represent the vulnerability of the animal. I mean, much of this film and much of references to Marker, it hasn't really been theorized much. They speak about Marker's menagerie, and I have to think it's not by accident that he has created these animal totems for himself. He wrote a very early essay in one of the political magazines saying the cat is also a person, and I think in his sort of claim for personhood for animals, he is making a sort of larger political statement. He populates his film with a number of the domestic animals and pets that he finds in cities. I mean, particularly cats. He's a sucker for cats, and in fact, many of his filmmaking peers sent him footage of cats, including this little guy in post-volcanic Iceland, sort of after on top of the lava flow. But one of the more shocking moments that again relates to that image I showed you of the gorilla hunt is this disturbing sequence from Soleil of a giraffe killing. The musical soundtrack moves from an ambient synchronized sound to electronic discordant tones, just as in previous sequences depicting an animal sex museum in Tokyo and terrified women subjugated by a male gaze in horror movies. And he provides a critical linkage sonically within the film between these sequences of horror, violence, and subjugation with the killing of the giraffe. The giraffe's hunter is shown on screen to be one of the Japanese horror movie villains, shooting a gun raised from the lower third of the frame to the center right of a frame in a shot that lasts a mere 15 frames, so half a second. In the next shot, the giraffe looks to the center left of its frame and buckles when shot. The continuity of the eye line, the cinematic gaze that crosses the cut, suggests that both of the figures are in Africa. This convention of shooting a two-figure scene, such as a conversation, involves blocking the body so that their gaze is directed at opposite sides of the compositional frame at the same angle, suggesting that they're looking at each other but remain oriented to the camera and ultimately to the viewer. In this case, Marker employs the techniques of an editor spotting that equiangular triangle within two different sources of found footage so as to construct this phantasmagoric but convincing killing of the giraffe. The editor cut between the two shots serve as a point of convergence of the gazes, a union which is completed by the viewer who occupies that third position toward whom the gazes on screen are directed. You're implicated when you watch the scene as being complicit, as someone who consumes violence, and you, even though you may not be the one to pull the trigger, you yourself as a consumer of this media are implicated in this exchange. The viewer is situated in a space outside of Japan and Africa, which removes an easy ethnocentric explanation for the depiction of violence. Just as Marker constructs a depersonalized first-person voice in the film, this use of the gaze constructs a cinematic space which exists nowhere in the world. The I is not an autobiographical I, and the where is not mapped. Marker just juxtaposes two cultures' images of violence against the vulnerable in this manner so as to focus on the essential humanness of the act, not the essential Japaneseness or Africanness or Europeanness. The dehumanization of making humans into animals that must take place in order to kill, wage war, or colonize is extended to the animal world in this sequence. The image of a hunter shooting the fallen giraffe occupies the frame. When we take a look overall at the political narratives within Soleil, they center around justice and fairness to all, particularly from the vantage of a filmmaker in the 1980s who's seen the failures of many of the movements he's documented. It seems as if the progressive project is completely abandoned. Marker extends this ethic of justice and fairness from all human groups to all species, using these animal narratives such as the Animal Sex Museum and the giraffe killing to engage the viewer in a visceral encounter with loss, suffering, and enslavement to power. Through this representation of the non-human other, and particularly the adoption of this nonlinear technology, Marker is able to position viewers in a world in which they're evaluating the dynamic roles of the human being within these man-made and human ecologies. Marker urges viewers toward a consideration of themselves as political beings, drawing attention in Soleil to the position of the powerful and powerless in sequence after sequence. He specifically emphasized the adoption of a historicizing gaze, one which debunks received wisdom and comfortable mythologies. He calls on viewers to critically analyze the folklore and mythologies of the world they encounter. His use of the animating gaze, this nonlinear narrative structure, the repetition of images, and recursive montage encourage the active engagement of the viewer in production of meaning in the film. By specifically focusing his historicizing gaze on the representation of machines and animals, the two opposing poles of culture and nature, Marker claims a universality for political engagement. He's become much more relevant, and in fact, Catherine Danelli just told me that she must forward to me the number of essays that have been published after his death this past summer in France that have not yet made it here. But thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
The animal deaths and that he's filming, presumably he didn't actually have animals killed to do the filming. So what's he doing to?
I mean, he is pretty widely drawn. I mean, he obscures as much as he reveals. I mean, anyone who creates so many fictional frames around themselves, I mean, they're revealing and obscuring in equal measures. I mean, as much as he reveals about his process or this sort of trying to open up within the film, this sort of process of image construction, he doesn't reveal where all of this found footage comes from. But he does work within this sort of, I mean, he's taking a starting point that I think is probably very familiar for those of us who live in the world of the internet or the world of hip-hop, of appropriation, that you're sort of taking these sort of found objects and integrating them into a new creative whole. And so he was in sort of advance of that practice. Yes?
You know, since time is entirely in the control of the photographer, could you talk a little bit more about why he emphasizes the past?
I mean, I think for him, the thematic emphasis within the film is Theodore Krasna, this fictional filmmaker who's writing these letters. I mean, we're to understand that he was a politically engaged filmmaker. He used to go around the world, to Russia, to Africa, to all of these different sort of revolutionary, very obviously Marxist demonstrations, making films to try and advance the cause. And every one of his causes around the world has failed. And that we're sort of watching the outtakes and his meditations of a sort of Thatcher, Reagan era period. And so part of the past for him is a melancholy longing for a time when he thought there was more hope and possibility for change. And I think also it's sort of a Marxist, I mean, even though he may be a sad Marxist, still a Marxist orientation towards understanding history and conflict as leading to some sort of new day. I mean, the tone is it's an elegy. The film really feels like an elegy. It focuses on death and memory, that the best days are behind us. But he's very concerned with this sort of mythologizing of history, of creating history into legend rather than trying to pin it down, and that he feels that media representations of these narratives are complicit. But that's part of it, and I do think he is obsessed with time. I mean, I think he loves the world in which he's making or was making films. It's hard for me to use the past tense with him. I sort of like knowing that he was out there in these different avatar forms creating work. But of course, the internet changes that relationship to the filmmaker. You can dwell as little or as long as you'd like on visual images in that kind of truly interactive medium, but film does lock you in.
Yeah. This, what you're describing seems to me to be a culture, a chronological primitivism, where in the beginning it is the best time, and everything thereafter is downhill.
You know, and perhaps that is my mistake in not showing some of the other sequences. He celebrates, particularly in Japan. I mean, I think part of the reason the film takes so much of the action of the film takes place in Japan is that he's really taking a look at the explosion of new technology. I mean, it includes animatronics, new video games, all sorts of celebration. I mean, he's someone that is not a Luddite. He loves new technology, but he wants responsible use of technology. He doesn't necessarily believe that that film and media is going to doom us, but nor does he believe it's going to save us. He believes that it requires that sort of true structure of a smart ecosystem, that the human user of technology has to understand their place between these different elements.
So there is a true progress.
He's still, I mean, he's pretty sad in '82, but he certainly, I mean, if we take a look at how this film might fit into his entire work, he's much more optimistic. I mean, he certainly was the last 10 years, I can't believe how productive he was, and in really non-traditional ways. I mean, much more so than any of the other, I mean, even though Godard is still making work, I mean, he is making the same work, whereas Marker has moved completely into a new language. There was another hand. Yes.
I was struck when you said early on that you keep looking at these things and you wonder how they're put together, and you figured out how all the other stuff has been put together, and it looked at times, it seemed at times as if you want to crack this guy's code.
I do.
But then once you've cracked his code, he is just
like all the other people whose code
he so far exceeds. You know, it's very interesting because when I first started writing about him, there really wasn't a close reading of Soleil that had been published, and I began to realize that project was impossible because it keeps rewriting itself within itself. So I mean, it would just be this endless document. And then there's a German theorist who writes about him as well, who just decided to create a generative interactive text to do that close reading, and so that it's become its own little wiki site where people put the time code up, and you just see this extended scroll of everybody's interpretation and links to other things. But it's sort of great that it's exploded out of its linearity in a way that he's wanted. But these are only things that have happened in the last few years. I mean, likewise, he began talking a little bit more about himself as he hit his 80s. He volunteered to come for the opening of a photography show at the Wexner Center in Ohio, and he befriended the curator there, and they were able to publish a catalog, and that was really the first signs of cracking open. And there have been 2 monographs that have been published in the last 2 years that help elucidate a little bit. I mean, he still was, you know, squirrely about his origins, but you know, I think more of that is going to be coming.
I was just thinking that, I mean, even when you're reading it from 1982, and you know, it's very of its moment and the kind of critique of the media and the kind of rigorous deconstruction of documentary or whatever, can you now, thinking about it, because you've been working on it for a while now, I mean, I don't mean that any, but
but true.
How do you think it relates to contemporary documentary, I guess?
Well, it's very interesting because we are in a contemporary documentary moment that is in love with the I. I mean, if the 70s was called the Me Generation, it's got nothing on the current documentary generation that you find in any film festival. Every film is a first-person film. There's a colleague of mine, who I will not name, that he is not on Facebook, he's not on MySpace or any of those things, and in the early years of these, he just conflated the two and just called it My Face. And I actually thought there was something that was sort of genius about that. But one of the interesting things with Marker is that he's really not interested in a diaristic exploration, like a sort of personal journal. His essay form, I mean, it's one of the ways in which his type of essay is so different from the sort of tenor of today. And of course, many of the sort of filmmakers are characters and sort of comic stars. I mean, I think about Michael Moore or Morgan Spurlock, who do this sort of stunt documentary. I mean, he is really much more of a sort of, I think of it as a sort of mid-20th century artist who really thought he could escape identity. I mean, that he has this international bent, and he thought he could achieve that universalism, and so he doesn't situate himself with a nationality, with a, you know, I mean, he really is trying to escape that. And much of the wave, I think, of contemporary work is, you know, it's about your race, ethnicity, class, gender. I mean, your identity politics determine what story you tell. And he tried diligently his entire life to escape that. Any other? Yes.
I'm just really interested to hear more about what you think he's doing with all this animal stuff.
Oh, yeah.
You said that we could talk about the emus afterwards.
Well, I do think the emus sort of, I mean, if people have patience, I mean, John Berger sort of wrote about why we look at animals. And if we take a look at sort of some of the history of animals and animal gaze, the zoo sort of appeared in the 19th century as an institution, almost as a sort of living museum. And it became, like many museum collections, like the sort of like statues also die, it became a way of the powerful and wealthy countries to collect these exotic specimens and put them on display, to be able to take them from people's and put them, you know, on a pedestal for those with privilege. And so I think Marker is sort of extending that sort of look at animals, these sort of emu on the Ile de France. I mean, he begins this film with a sort of consideration that the 19th century problem was place and the 20th century problem is time. I think that's an elusive way of talking about that sort of colonial power, and that the emu becomes this image of a sort of colonial legacy, that this sort of seizing of this, you know, animal that's so out of place in the middle of urban Paris is like so many other things that are an expression of France. And so I think he's taking a look at the sort of ways in which sort of animals become part of this continuing, what we think of as a sort of human history, but they are sort of an extension of this sort of colonizing power, this abuse. And that he also uses the animal gaze within the film, the looking in the animal's eyes, as a sort of node or concentration. I spoke about times in which it seems like the sound and the image are really separate. He tends to use that animal look or animal gaze as a place in which you, the viewer, are sort of rooted back in to, it's almost like in a train station, that's the place where you'd switch from the red line to the blue line, that he provides that sort of look of the animal. We can't really fully understand or comprehend the sort of animal's look in that moment, but it provides a kind of anchor and connection. And I think that those perhaps are some of the ways in which he provides a little bit more of an optimistic reading of the role of media, that, you know, we might have a presumptive view that we understand or know more than we do by being consumers of media, but without it, how do we even half connect with places we can't physically get ourselves to? Yes?
Was Marker a religious person?
I doubt it. We know it's so hard. I mean, it's so hard to know. I sincerely, he tended not to belong to any group. I mean, even groups that wanted to claim him. So I would find it hard to believe, but it's that kind of information, and you know, even the two biographies that have been released. He really did just appear on the scene in the 1940s. So we just know so little about his early formative years, so I don't even know what in what he may have been raised.
I was thinking with cats, the non-lives, reincarnation.
He's fascinated. Religion moves through this film as a theme, but it moves through in a much more humanistic understanding of perhaps valuable rituals about how to deal with grief and loss, which definitely, as this sort of sad, politically engaged filmmaker in a sort of Thatcherite world, you know, he's mourning his own losses. But I would be surprised to find a religious affiliation for him.